Welcome back to the Obby series. In today's episode, we're going to be creating the setting system. Anyways, with that being said, let's hop right into it. So, hopping right into Roblox Studio, the first thing that we're going to do is actually go ahead and create the on-screen button for displaying the settings GUI. And we're actually going to add this button to the left button's GUI that we created a few episodes ago. So inside of the Star GUI, we of course have the left GUI, and then inside of there, we have the frame, and now of course we have the social button. Let's go ahead and duplicate this button, and then we'll go ahead and rename one of them to be called settings. Then inside of this button, we of course have an icon image label and a title text label. Let's first go ahead and update the text of the title text label to go ahead and say settings. Then for the icon, let's go ahead and update the image of that, and we'll find wherever our settings image actually is inside of here, which mine is right here, and we'll go ahead and use that one. Now, if you don't have your own settings icon, then you can actually use the one that we're using in this episode for completely free. There's a link down below in the description, which will take you to my website, which contains a page where you can actually access this icon pack for completely free. Of course, if you saw the last episode, then you already know about that, so I won't go too much into that. But with that being said, we're actually pretty much completely finished with creating this button. We have one last thing that we could do, and what that is we could actually modify the layout order of this button. For instance, if we want this button to appear before or above the social button that we created previously. So by default, the layout order of every instance is set to 0. And now, if we want the settings button to appear before the social button, what we could do is either set the layout order of the settings button to -1, because of course -1 is less than 0, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-Z to undo that. And alternatively, what we could do is if we wanted the social button to appear below the settings button, we could actually set the layout order of this to 1, for example. Because of course 1 is greater than 0, so that means that the social button will appear after the settings button because of the layout order. And if for some reason your layout order is not adjusting properly, what I would make sure you do is go to the UI grid layout and look at the sort order property and make sure that it is set to layout order. If it's not set to layout order, then it will be set to name. And of course, your buttons will then be sorted by their name rather than the layout order, which is way easier to work with, in my opinion. So what I did for my layout order is I set social to 1 and I left the settings at 0. As we add more buttons to this, we'll of course probably make some changes as well in the future, but I just wanted to show you that quick little lesson right there. With that being said, we're done with inside of the left GUI, so we can go ahead and collapse that. And now let's actually go ahead and create the settings GUI. So we'll go ahead and add in a brand new screen GUI to our starter GUI, and we'll rename this to be called settings. Then we'll go ahead and create a frame inside of here, and let's go ahead and adjust the sizing of this. On the offset of both the X and the Y, we're actually going to set those to 600. So we'll say 0, 600, 0, 600. And then of course we want to go ahead and center that. So for the anchor point, we'll set both of those to 0.5, and for the scale on both the X and the Y position, we'll go ahead and set that to 0.5 as well. Now that we've resized and repositioned that frame, let's go ahead and update the background color of this. And I like to use a nice little blue, so this is the color that I'm going to go with. And then I'm going to tilt my screen a little bit so it's a lot easier to see. Actually, maybe I'll kind of like go very close to a white surface so that it makes it a lot easier to see. Then inside of this frame, we're going to go ahead and add in a UI corner to this so that of course we can round the edges. For the corner radius, we're going to go ahead and set the offset from 8 to 22 to make them a little bit more curved. Then we'll also go ahead and throw in a UI stroke to this as well. For the thickness of this, we're going to set that to 5. And now let's go ahead and create the exit button. So inside of here, we're going to go ahead and create a text button, and we'll go ahead and rename this to be called exit. Let's go ahead and update the background color of this. So I'm going to set this to a nice little red. And if you want to see what that red looks like right here, this is what it is. Then for the text of this, we're actually going to clear that out. So we'll just set it to blank so that we don't actually see any text. Then for the size of this on both the X and the Y offset, we're going to actually set it to 65 by 65, just like that. And now we want to reposition this at the top right-hand corner of our frame. And we also want it to appear a little bit off of the frame as well. So to do that, for the anchor point on the X, we're going to set that to 1. And for the position on the X scale, we're going to set that to 1 as well, which makes this appear towards the right-hand side of the frame. And now, like I said, we want this to appear a little bit outside of the frame. So remember what we set the size to. For the size, we set it to 65 by 65. Now, when it comes to positioning, to kind of position this perfectly, what we want to do is we want to divide the axis on the size by 2. And then that's how many pixels we want to offset this by. First, we'll go ahead and adjust the position on the X-axis. Now, of course, since these sizes are the exact same, we can just do the math a single time and figure that out. But to make this a little bit easier to understand, since we're first going to adjust the position on the X offset, we would go ahead and take the X offset of the size and then divide that by 2. So what is 65 divided by 2? Well, let's go back to the position, and on the X offset, we'll go ahead and set that to 32. Of course, 65 divided by 2 is 32.5, so you could choose to either go with 32 or 33. I'm going to go with 32. And then we're going to do the exact same thing on the Y, because the size on the Y-axis is exactly the same. So we can go ahead and say 32, but when we do that, that makes this appear a little bit further down. So what we would want to do instead is we would actually want to set this to -32 so that it makes this text button move a little bit further up. And now we have that nicely positioned at the top right hand corner of our frame. Then what we can do is go ahead and duplicate both the UI corner and the UI stroke and drag that directly inside of the exit button. We'll first go ahead and adjust the UI corner, and we're going to go ahead and set the corner radius to 18 to make those a little bit less curved. And then for the UI stroke, we don't actually see any stroke on this, and that is because of the apply stroke mode. Currently, it's set to contextual, and since the parent of this is a text button, contextual means that the UI stroke is trying to be applied to the text inside of the text button. So what we would want to do is change the apply stroke mode to border, and now we can actually see the UI stroke around it. Then the next thing we're going to want to do is actually add in a text label to this, and we're going to go ahead and rename this to be called X. The name of it doesn't actually matter at all, but we're going to go ahead and set the text of this text label to just an X. For the text color, we're actually going to go ahead and set that to white. For the text size, we're going to go ahead and make this 38. Then let's go ahead and set the background transparency of this to 1 so that we don't see that background. We'll go ahead and adjust the sizing of this, and on both the X and the Y scale, we're going to set those to 1, so we'll do it just like that. Then let's go ahead and change the font, and we actually want to go with Fredoka 1, as we usually do. And that's pretty much all the properties that we have to modify of that text label. The next thing we want to do is duplicate the UI stroke inside of here and add it directly to the X text label. And now since we've just duplicated it, we actually want to change the apply stroke mode back from border over to contextual, and now we can see the UI stroke surrounding our text label. And with that being said, we're actually fully finished with creating the exit button. So going back to our frame, the next thing that we want to do is actually create the little title display inside of this frame. So to do that, we're going to go inside of the frame and add in a brand new frame. We'll go ahead and rename this to be called title. And now the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and update the background color of this. And basically, I'm just making it a slightly darker blue so that it appears nicely over top of this lighter blue color. Then let's go ahead and resize this. So on the X offset, we're going to set that to 365. And on the Y, we're going to set that to 75. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and center this horizontally. So we'll go ahead and say 0.5 on the anchor point of the X. And we'll go ahead and say 0.5 once again on the X scale of the position. Now that's centered horizontally. And now we want to move it a little bit further down from the top. So for the offset of the Y axis, we'll go ahead and set that to 20 so that there's a little bit of spacing between this element and the top of the frame. And then the next thing that we need to do is actually add in a text label inside of here, but to save us some time, what we're going to do is actually duplicate the X text label inside of our exit button and put that inside of the title frame. Then let's go ahead and rename this to be called title. And for the text of this, we're actually going to go ahead and just say settings. Now, doing that saves us a bunch of different properties that we would usually have to modify, but one of the properties that we still have to modify is the text size, and we want to enlarge this a little bit, so we're going to go ahead and set that to 60. And now we're actually done with modifying this text label, but the last thing that I want to do with the UI stroke is actually change the line join mode from round to either miter or bevel. It doesn't really show in this scenario, but I believe that we've gone over this previously. If you look at the G, you can kind of see that a G sort of has a circle in the middle of it. And when the line join mode is round, sometimes that circle isn't filled in completely, and in my opinion, that just looks really bad. So to solve that, I'll either go with bevel or miter to make it look better. So now we're actually done with that text label, but the next thing that we need to do is go ahead and add in a UI corner to this title frame. And for the UI corner radius, we're actually going to make this pretty large, so we're going to go ahead and set it to 32, and now those corners are quite round. And with that being said, we're actually done with creating the title frame as well, so we can go ahead and collapse that. So going back to the frame, the last thing that we have to do is create something in order for us to easily display all of the settings to the player. And how we're going to do this is by actually using a scrolling frame. You can think of a scrolling frame exactly the same as a normal frame, but pretty much the only difference is that a scrolling frame can actually be scrolled through. So the first thing we want to do with the scrolling frame is go ahead and rename this to be called container, because it's going to contain all of our settings that we want to display to the player. Then let's go ahead and resize this. Now on the x-axis, we're actually going to use scale for this, so we're going to set the x scale to 0.95, and for the y-axis, we're going to use offset, so we want to set this to 460 for the y offset. Then of course we want to go ahead and reposition this. Of course we want to center this horizontally, so we'll go ahead and set the x to 0.5 there, and then we want to move this down quite a bit, so we're actually going to set the y offset to 120. And now we have that positioned pretty nicely. Then we'll go ahead and set the background transparency of this to 1 so that we don't see the background. I would like to go ahead and update the scroll bar image color to make this brighter rather than dark. So I'm going to go ahead and change this from being a dark black to being a bright white. Now we're not fully finished with setting up this container frame, but we will come back to it in just a second. I think it makes a lot more sense to start adding things inside of this container frame before we modify a few other settings to make it a lot easier to understand why we're modifying those specific properties. So inside of the container frame, we actually want to go ahead and add in a UI grid layout. In addition to the UI grid layout, we also want to add a frame inside of here as well. Now we're going to go ahead and duplicate this frame a couple of times just so I can quickly explain what a UI grid layout actually is. Basically, a UI grid layout allows us to easily display multiple different GUI instances with a specific size and with a specific padding or spacing in between each of those instances. You can think of it very similar to a UI list layout, which I've explained previously, but the UI grid layout allows us to specify the cell size and the cell padding. So that is the primary difference. If you look at the properties inside of here, we can see a lot of the similar properties shared with the UI list layout, such as the fill direction, the sort order, the horizontal alignment, the vertical alignment, and different things like that. So when it comes to the cell size property, we of course have our X and Y axis. And you can think of a cell as pretty much one of the instances that you're displaying. So for the cell size on the X-axis, we're actually going to set the scale of this to 0.95. And then for the offset, we'll go ahead and set that to 0. And we can now see that all of our frames are taking up 95% of our container frame's width. And then to adjust the height of these on the Y-axis, we're going to go ahead and adjust the offset. And we're going to set that to 65 because we want each of these to be 65 pixels tall. Then if we look at the cell padding, again, we have the X and the Y offset. And we just want to go ahead and adjust the Y offset here. And we're going to go ahead and set that to 15 because we want there to be a spacing of 15 pixels between each of these. It might not look great right now, but in just a minute, you'll see exactly why we're doing this. The one last thing that we want to do is scroll down a little bit to the alignment, and we want to adjust the horizontal alignment from left to center because now we can see that those frames have now been centered. Now that we understand what a UI grid layout is, like I said, we didn't fully adjust all of the properties of the container scrolling frame, so what I'm going to do is duplicate even more frames so that I can now explain to you all of the other properties that we want to modify on the container. So now I have a bunch of frames inside of here, and if we look at our scrolling frame, we can see the scroll bar right there. Let's go ahead and scroll down a little bit. Now, it might not be obvious to you, so what I'm doing is actually selecting these things inside of my Explorer so that we can see them outlined inside of Studio. And now, as we can see, this is the furthest that I can actually scroll. I cannot scroll any further, but there are still frames which are not being displayed inside of our container. So what we want to do is we want to make our scrolling frame actually scale and display all of the elements that are added inside of it. And how can we do that? Well, we want to actually adjust the automatic canvas size and the default canvas size as well. So for the automatic canvas size, we actually want to set this to Y because we want the canvas size to change based on how many elements we're actually displaying inside of here. So now we can see that we can actually scroll even further down, and if we select the very last frame that we created, we can see that that is actually being displayed inside of here. Now I'm going to go ahead and actually delete all of these frames except for one. And now when I do that, we can see that I still have a scrolling frame, but we're able to scroll down very far even though nothing is even being displayed here. So do we actually want to let the player scroll down this far even though nothing is being displayed? Probably not. So in order to fix that, what we would do is we would change the canvas size. By default, the canvas size is set to 2 on the Y scale. So let's go ahead and change 2 to 0, and now we can see that the scroll bar has actually completely disappeared. But don't worry, once we actually have enough elements stored inside of here, the scroll bar will appear, and we're now able to scroll a little bit further down and see all of those things that we've added. So now our scrolling frame is scaling perfectly based on the amount of elements that are stored inside of here. Now, there's pretty much one more property that we want to change with the container, and that's because of how our frames are being displayed with the scroll bar. In my opinion, the frames appear a little bit too close to the scroll bar, and we would rather have a little bit more spacing in between them. So in order to do that, what we're going to look for is the vertical scroll bar inset property on the container frame. And by default, this is set to none, but we want to go ahead and set that to always. Now that we've set that to always, we can see that there's now been a little bit of spacing applied to the frame and the scroll bar. So now our frames are no longer too close to the scroll bar and almost look like they're overlapping or appearing under it. And with that being said, we're pretty much finished with changing all those properties on the container. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all of those extra frames, just leaving one. Now, actually getting around to working on this frame, the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and rename this to be called template. Then we're going to use the same background color for this as we used for the title frame. So we can go ahead and directly copy the background color there and paste it into there. Then we want to go ahead and add in a UI stroke to this. And for the color of this, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and select the same color of this frame, but then we'll go ahead and just make it a little bit darker. And now for the thickness of this, we're going to go ahead and set that to 3. Now, as soon as we've done that with the UI stroke, we should instantly be able to see an issue with this. And that issue is that we don't actually see the stroke towards the top of this frame. If we duplicate this frame though, we can actually see that the stroke is appearing perfectly fine as it normally would. So in order to solve this, what we need to do is actually add in a UI padding inside of our container. And with the UI padding, we want to actually add in a tiny bit of padding towards the top. So we'll go ahead and set this to 5 so that there's 5 pixels between the top of our first template and the container frame, which is effectively cutting off the stroke from the template frame. Now that's not the only thing that we need to do with UI padding though, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. So I'm going to duplicate this a couple more times until the scroll bar actually appears, and now let me scroll all the way down. Once I scroll all the way down, we can see that we pretty much have the opposite issue that we had at first, and now we don't see the stroke towards the bottom of our last template that's being displayed here. So how did we solve this the first time? Well, we added a little bit of padding to the top. So now how can we solve it this time? Well, all we have to do is add a little bit of padding to the bottom as well, and now we can go ahead and scroll a little bit further down, and we can now see that that last template is being perfectly displayed. If we scroll all the way back towards the top, we can now see that the first template is being perfectly displayed as well. So now all of the templates are being displayed, and we don't have to worry about their stroke being cut off from the topmost one or the bottommost one. So we can go ahead and delete all of the other templates except for this one. Also, why did I name this frame template? The reason that I named this template is because we're effectively creating a template. When we come around to scripting this, what we're going to do is we're going to clone this template for every single setting that we have in our game in order to display all of them. If that explanation wasn't great for you, don't worry. As we further create the template, it should become easier to understand exactly what I mean. Anyways, going inside of the template, the next thing we want to do is add in a text label to this. But to save us some time, what I'm going to do is go ahead and duplicate the title text label from inside of our title frame and drag it inside of the template. Then I'll go ahead and rename this text label to actually be called setting. And for the text of this, we're going to go ahead and set it to a pretty long setting just so that we can see how it appears and make sure that we get the sizing right. So I'm going to go ahead and say show other pets. Of course, keep in mind there are no pets actually in our game. That's just another setting that I've used in games previously, and it's just a long setting name, and it's the first one that I thought of. Anyways, let's go ahead and resize this text label. Instead of using scale, we actually want to use offset. And on the x-axis, we're going to go ahead and set that to 450 on the offset. And on the y, we're going to go ahead and set that to 32. The reason that we're setting that to 32 is because we're actually going to also modify the text size and set that to 32 as well. Now that we've done that, we also want to go ahead and modify the text X alignment from center over to left so that the text appears towards the left. And we're pretty much finished with that text label. The next thing we want to do is actually add in a UI list layout to this. And then let's modify the UI list layout a little bit. First, we want to modify the fill direction from vertical to horizontal because we're actually going to display two things inside of this template and we want them to be laid out horizontally. Then for the horizontal alignment, we're actually going to set this to center. And for the vertical alignment, we want to change that from top to center as well. And now we're finished with setting up the UI list layout. The next thing that we want to do is actually add a button inside of this template, which the players can click on in order to toggle on or off their setting. We'll of course also use this button to actually display the status of the setting as well, and we'll change the color based on if it is toggled off or on. So to save us some time, let's go ahead and duplicate the exit button, drag that inside of the template. We'll go ahead and rename this from being called exit to being called toggle. For the size of this, we want to make it a little bit smaller. So on both the X and the Y offset, we're going to go ahead and set this to 30 by 30. Then inside of this button, we do have our X text label. Let's just go ahead and delete that text label because we don't need any inside of it. For the UI corner inside of here, we do want to make it a little bit less round, or if you like the circle, then that's perfectly fine. You can keep it that way, but I kind of want to make it a little bit more of a square or a square with roundish corners. So I'm going to set the corner radius to 10 on the offset. Then for the UI stroke, we want to decrease the size of this a little bit as well. So I'm going to change the thickness from 5 to 3. And I think that's looking pretty good. And that's all that we have to do for the toggle button. And now I almost forgot. Let's go ahead and add in a UI corner to the template as well. And we're only going to round those corners a little bit. So I'm actually going to change the corner radius to 10, just like that. And with that being said, we're actually fully finished with creating the template. We can go ahead and collapse that and then duplicate it a couple of times and see how these settings are displayed inside of here. So we can get a quick glimpse as to what it looks like when we display multiple settings inside of here. And I think that's all looking perfectly. But of course, you can make any changes to this that you want to. With that being said, we're going to delete all the templates except for one. And then we can go ahead and collapse our primary frame just like that. And we are finished with creating this UI, but we do need to do one more thing. Well, actually, two more things. One, we need to update some properties on the screen GUI, which I should have done in the first place. Of course, we want to go ahead and set ignore GUI inset to true, and we want to set reset on spawn to false, as we do with every single GUI that we create. Then we're going to go ahead and duplicate the UI scale that we created in one of our other screen GUIs and drag that inside of our settings GUI. And now we have actually fully finished creating the screen GUI. So what I'm going to do is actually set the enable property of this to false so that I don't see that. But if you're following along with this video, it might make scripting this a little bit easier to understand if you actually keep that open in case you need to look at that while we're going through the scripting portion of this. Now that we finished creating the GUI, we can begin scripting this. Although it's going to be a bit before we actually get around to fully scripting this GUI. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse the starter GUI. In order to begin scripting this, the first thing that we're going to do is actually create a config module for our settings. So inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new module script. Of course, we're going to go ahead and rename this to be called settings. And inside of here, we'll go ahead and create our local local variable, which will be equal to a table, and a shared variable, which is going to be equal to a table as well. Then, of course, we'll go ahead and return the shared table. Then, towards the top of our script, the first thing that we're going to do is actually create a type for our settings. So we're going to say export type, and the name of our type is going to be setting. And this type is going to be a string union, and each of those strings are going to be a different setting. So our first setting is going to be called easy mode. We'll then use the pipe symbol, and our second setting is going to be called music. Then our third setting is going to be called sound effects. And our final setting is going to be called menu blur. And now that we've created that type, we're going to go ahead and create a second type, which is going to be called settings config. And this type is going to be a table, more specifically a dictionary. To specify the type of our keys, we're going to use open and closing brackets. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and specify the setting type. Then we'll use a colon and specify the value of the key, which is going to be a boolean. Now that we've specified that type, let's go ahead and actually use it. And in order to use this type, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called config. We'll set the type of this to the settings config type that we just created. And then we'll actually go ahead and create this. So we'll go ahead and set that equal to a table. And like I said, this is going to be a dictionary. So for our key, we'll go ahead and first add the easy mode setting. And then we'll set the value of that equal to false. And the values that we're actually setting here are going to be the default value of what the setting will be set to when the player joins the game for the first time. So when the player joins the game for the first time, we're actually going to have easy mode disabled. But then for our second setting, which is going to be music, we're actually going to set this to true because we want the music to automatically play when the player joins the game for the first time. Then we have our third setting, which of course is sound effects, and we'll also set that to true as well. And then we'll also enable menu blur so we can set that setting to true as well. Now that we've created the settings config, let's go ahead and share that with any script that requires this module script. So to do that, we'll go ahead and add that to the shared table by saying shared.config, and then we'll set that to the config variable that we just created. Now, the reason that we need to create the config as a local variable, of course, is because you cannot specify the type of a variable if it is directly inside of a table. So we first have to create the local version of this variable, specify the type of it, and then we can go ahead and share that variable just like this. And now the type is included when we share that variable as well, which is exactly what we want. Now, there's one last thing that we have to do inside of here, and that is actually create a shared function. So we're going to create a function which is a part of the shared table, and this function is going to be called getSettingValue. This is going to accept the player's data, which we're not actually going to specify the type of this, and it'll also accept the specific setting, which is going to be of the setting type. Now, the reason that we're not specifying the data type is because anywhere we actually export the player's data type, those module scripts are going to be requiring this module script as well, which you'll see why in just a minute. So it literally prevents us from being able to require those modules in order to specify the type of the player's data, because a module which is required from another module is not allowed to then require that module, as that will create a circle dependency. So modules cannot depend on each other, which is a very annoying thing, and it really requires us to go out of our way sometimes and just do things that we don't want to, or prevents us from even being able to do certain things that we might want to do. Like, we would want to require that module now so we could specify the data type, but we're unfortunately unable to do that. Anyways, it's not really that important here because it is extremely simple what we're doing inside of this function. Basically, we're just going to use this function to check the player's data for what the setting is actually set to. So we want to determine if the setting is set to true or false, aka does the player have the setting enabled or disabled. And how are we going to do this? Well, we'll go ahead and return data.settings, and then we'll index that table with the specific setting. Now, of course, we didn't create the settings table yet, but we're actually just about to begin doing that now. So with that being said, we're actually fully finished with creating the entire settings config, so we can go ahead and close out of that. Then, like I said, we're actually about to add the settings table to the player's data. So in order to do that, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage and open up the player data module script. Inside of here, towards the top of the script, we actually want to go ahead and require the settings config that we just created. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. Then we'll say require script.parent.configs.settings. And now, inside of our player data type variable, let's go ahead and update the player's data to now include settings inside of here as well. So we'll add another key inside of here, which is going to be called settings. And now we'll specify the type of this by setting this to a table. And now this table will actually be the same type as our settings config. So it'll be a dictionary using settings as a key and a boolean as the value. So now that we've specified that type inside of our player's data, we definitely have to update the default player data variable with all of the player settings. But first, let's actually go ahead and create a variable with all of the settings, and we'll specify their value before we add that to the player's data. So to do this, we're going to create a variable called settings data, and it's going to be equal to a table. Then what we're going to do is we're actually going to loop through all of the settings inside of the settings config.config. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to index the settings data variable with the setting, and then we're going to set that equal to the value, as that is what the default value actually is. And now that we've done that, we can go ahead and add that table directly inside of the default player's data. So we'll go ahead and say settings equals settings data, just like that. And now we've actually added the settings to the player's data. So with that being said, we can go ahead and close out of this module. Now, while we're inside of the replicated storage, let's go ahead and actually update the state manager as well, because we want to add the action for updating the player's settings whenever they toggle them on or off. So inside of the replicated storage, we have our functions folder, and inside of here, we have the update state module script. Inside of here, we already require the player data module script, but we also want to go ahead and require the settings config as well. So we're going to say require replicated storage.configs.settings, just like that. Then we'll go down to the update state action type, and we want to add another table to this. So for the type of this, we're going to go ahead and say update setting. And now this is actually going to have 3 key value pairs. So first we'll have the type, then we'll have the setting, which of course is going to be the specific setting that we want to update. And then finally, we'll have the value that we're toggling it to, which is going to be a boolean. Now I, of course, need to go ahead and fix this formatting just like that. And now we've actually updated this type, but then we have to go down to this function and update this as well. So beneath our last else if statement, we're going to go ahead and add in another else if statement, and we'll say if action type equals, and now we want to check if it is the update setting action type. And if it is the update setting action type, what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the player's data, inside of the settings table, we'll index that table with the action.setting, and then we'll set that to the brand new value that we passed through to here as well. So that's how we're going to go ahead and update the player state anytime they toggle a setting either on or off. And now that we've done that, we can go ahead and close out of this module script as well, because we're finished with updating the state. Now we have one last thing that we need to do inside of the replicated storage, and that is creating the networking so that the client can communicate to the server whenever they want to toggle a setting on or off. So to do this, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the remotes folder, inside of the player data folder, and we're going to go ahead and create another remote event. I'm just going to duplicate one of the ones that we already have inside of here, and we're going to call this brand new remote event update setting. So whenever the player wants to update one of their settings, what they'll do is click the button in our GUI, and when they click that button, we'll use this remote event to communicate from the client over to the server what setting they want to go ahead and toggle. And now that we've done that, we can actually collapse the entire replicated storage because we're done with inside of there. The next thing that we're going to do is actually create the setting service on the server side for implementing all of the logic to manage the player settings on, of course, the server side. So we'll go inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, and then we'll go ahead and create another module script inside of here. We'll go ahead and rename this to be called setting service. And of course, let's go ahead and create our usual variables inside of here as well. Now, towards the top of our script, we want to go ahead and create a variable for the replicated storage. And now that we've created a variable for that service, we also need to require a couple of modules inside of here as well. The first module that we need to require is actually the player data service. So how do we get that? Well, we would say script.parent.player data service, just like that. In addition to that, we need to require the settings config. So we'll go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and then we'll go ahead and require the settings module script. And now finally, we want to create a variable for the remotes folder as well. So we'll go ahead and say replicated storage.remotes. And now that we've required all of those, what we're going to do is go ahead and create our first function, which is going to be a shared function, and this is going to be called toggle setting. This function is going to have 2 parameters. The first one is going to be a player, and the second one is going to be the specific setting that the player is wanting to toggle, which of course is of the setting type. Now, the first thing that we want to do inside of this function is actually confirm that the setting does actually exist. The reason for this is because if there's a hacker in our game, they could actually cause this function to be ran with a non-existing setting or just a random string inside of here, and that could cause errors on the server side and even cause the server to crash as a worst case scenario. So we're going to create a variable called does setting exist, and now to check if a setting actually exists, what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the settings config, inside of the actual config, and then we're going to index that with the specific setting. Then what we want to do is we want to check if does setting exist equals nil, because if it does equal nil, then we want to go ahead and return n and stop the function right there because the setting does not actually exist. And the reason that we need to check if that equals nil is because remember, the value here is going to be a boolean, so it could either be true or false. So that's why we have to check for if it's nil, because if we just say not does setting exist, then that could mean that it's either nil or it literally does not exist. But when we check if it's nil, then we know that it does not actually exist. Now that we know that the setting does actually exist, let's go ahead and get the player state. So we'll create a variable called state, And then to get the player state, we want to use the player data service, and we'll use the get state function passing through the player. Of course, if we're not able to get that state, then we want to return n to stop the function right there. But now that we have the player state and we know that the setting exists, let's go ahead and actually toggle the setting to the opposite value of what it currently is. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called current value. And to get the current value, we'll say state.settings, and then we'll index that with the specific setting. And then we'll go ahead and create a variable called action. And we'll specify the type of this to be playerDataService.updateStateAction, and we'll set that equal to a table. And now, of course, what do we want to do inside of here? Well, we're going to specify the type of this to update setting. Then for the setting, what setting do we want to update? Well, whatever setting was passed to this function. And then what do we want to set the value to? Well, we're going to go ahead and set it to whatever the opposite of the current value is, just like that. And then finally, we need to go ahead and actually update the player state, which we can do using the player data service. So we'll say playerDataService.updateState, we'll pass through the player, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the action. And that's actually all that we're going to do with inside of this function. So we're fully finished with creating that. And now let's go ahead and create our usual onStart function, which does not have any parameters. And what do we want to do inside of this function? Well, we want to actually connect our toggle setting function that we just created to the update setting remote event that we created just before this. So we'll say remotes.playerData.updateSetting.onServerEvent::connect, and then we'll go ahead and connect this to the shared.toggle setting function just like that. And now, of course, on the client side, we'll go ahead and fire off the update setting remote event, passing through the specific setting that we want to update, aka toggle or change the value of. And then once the server gets that, it'll make sure that the setting actually exists, then we'll get the player state, and then we will change the setting to the opposite of what the value currently is set to, and then we'll update the player state to reflect that. And that's actually all that we have to do inside of the service. It is a very simple one. With that being said, we can go ahead and close out of this because we're finished with that. And we're actually done with inside of the server script service, so we can collapse that entirely as well. And now we're going to begin implementing this on the client side. So the first thing that we're going to do to begin implementing this on the client side is create the settings controller. In order to do that, we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the controllers folder, and then we're going to go ahead and create a brand new module script. Of course, we'll go ahead and rename this module script to be called settings controller, and then we'll of course go ahead and make our usual variables. Now that we've made our usual 2 variables, the next thing that we're going to do is actually create a variable for the replicated storage. Now that we've created that variable, we also want to create a variable for the state controller as well, and we can do that by saying require script.parent.stateController. We also want to create a variable for the settings config, which is located inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and it is the settings module script. And then we also want to create a variable for the remotes folder, which is inside of the replicated storage. And we can even be a little bit more specific here. We only care about the player data remotes anyway, so we'll just go ahead and set the variable like that. Now that we've created all those variables, the first thing that we're going to do is create the function for toggling a setting or updating it, aka replicating our change from the client to the server. So this is going to be a shared function, and we're going to call this toggle setting. It's going to accept the setting that we want to toggle, which of course is of the settings config.setting type. And this function is incredibly simple. All we're going to do is use that remote event that we created earlier called update setting. We're going to go ahead and fire that to the server with the specific setting that we want to go ahead and toggle. Now, we're not actually going to use this function anywhere inside of this script, but we will use it inside of other scripts. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and create another function, which is going to be a part of the local table, and it's going to be called update setting. This is going to accept the specific setting and the value, which of course is a boolean that the setting has been toggled to. And we're actually not going to do anything inside of this function, but in the future, when we actually implement some of the other systems that our settings rely on, such as music, sound effects, easy mode, and different things like that, this is a function where we'll actually handle when the value of the setting changes, and then we'll do things like disable or enable the music, or disable or enable hearing sound effects, or disable or enable easy mode, and all of those different things like that. So I'm just going to leave a comment here which says handle music / sound effects / easy mode. And then of course, whenever we get around to implementing the first of these, we'll go ahead and update this function to actually handle that. Now, the last thing that we're going to do inside of here is go ahead and create the standard onStart function. And what are we going to do inside of here? Well, this is actually where we'll hook the update setting function to. So we want to call the update setting function whenever the player's settings have been updated according to the state. So we'll do that by using the state controller and the update state bindable event. We'll go ahead and connect to this. And of course, we'll go ahead and get the action. So we'll say stateController.updateStateAction. And now, if the action.type equals update setting, then we know that a setting has been toggled. So we'll go ahead and call update setting, passing through the action.setting and the action.value as well. And similar to the settings service, the settings controller is very simple as well. So that's actually all that we're going to do inside of here. So we can go ahead and save this and close out of it. And now to begin actually scripting the GUI, the first thing that we want to do is actually update the GUI controller. So let's go ahead and open up this module script. And now towards the top of our script, we actually want to go ahead and create two brand new variables. The first variable that we want to create is for the lighting service. So we'll say game get service. And then we also want to create a variable for the replicated storage as well. Now that we've created those two variables, we then actually want to require the settings config. So we'll say settings config equals require replicated storage.configs.settings. Then we'll also create a variable for the state controller. To get the state controller, we'll go ahead and require script.parent.stateController, just like that. Now that we've gotten the state controller, the next thing that we want to do is actually create a blur effect. The reason that we're creating the blur effect is because we'll actually use this effect to basically blur the player's screen whenever they open up a GUI. This might sound odd, but it's actually a kind of cool effect that you can do, and in my opinion, it just kind of makes your GUIs look a little bit more cooler. Anyway, let's go ahead and create a variable called blur effect, which is going to be equal to instance.new, and we're going to go ahead and create a blur effect, and we'll parent that to the lighting service. Then what we want to do is we actually want to set the size property of the blur effect to 0 so that there is no blur actually present at this time. Then when we want to make the blur effect present, we'll of course go ahead and modify the size of this and increase it to actually make the blur appear. Now that we've done all of those things, let's then go down to our GUIs variable and add the settings GUI that we just created. So we'll go ahead and say settings equals player GUI, wait for child, settings, just like that. And now what we're going to do is actually script in the blur effect logic. So we'll go down towards the bottom of our script and we'll go ahead and create a brand new shared function. This is going to be called toggle blur effect, and it's going to have a single parameter, which is going to be called is GUI active, and that is going to be a boolean. Now, what this parameter actually means is if the GUI is active, then we want to make the blur effect visible. But if the GUI is not active, then we would like to hide the blur effect. But the first thing that we want to do inside of this function is determine if the player even has the blur effect setting enabled. So we'll create a variable called is setting enabled. And now to determine if the setting is enabled, we're actually going to use the function that we created earlier inside of the settings config, which is called get setting value. We'll then go ahead and pass through the player state. So we'll say stateController.getState. And then we'll go ahead and pass through the specific setting as well, which is called menu blur. Now, if the GUI is active and the setting is not enabled, then we're going to stop the function right there because we should avoid blurring the screen if the setting is disabled. After that, we're going to create a variable called target size. And this refers to what size we actually want to make the blur effect. So if the GUI is active, then of course we want to actually blur the screen. So we would set the size to 14. Otherwise, we're going to set it to 0 because we would not want to display the blur effect. Now, that's pretty much all that we have to do. And then we could just directly set the size of the blur effect. But rather than doing that, let's actually use the tween service to make this look a little bit smoother. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called tweeninfo, which is going to be equal to tweeninfo.new. How long do we want this to take? Well, we want this to be rather quick, so we're going to say 0.15, which is a 15th of a second. Then for the easing style, we're going to go ahead and use linear. And then for the easing direction, we're going to go ahead and use in out. Then we're going to go ahead and create a variable called tweenGoal, which is going to be equal to a table. And then we're going to say tweenGoal.size equals target size. And then we'll go ahead and create our tween. So we'll say tween service :create. What do we want to tween? Well, we want to tween the blur effect. We can then pass through the tween info. And then for our property table, we just simply pass through the tween goal that we just created, just like that. Now that we've created that tween, let's go ahead and actually use it. So we'll say tween:play to make the tween actually play. And there we go. Now we fully created the toggle blur effect function. Now let's actually go ahead and use this function. And where are we going to use it? Well, we're actually going to go ahead and go towards the top of our script, and we're going to go ahead and create the shared.onStart function. Now inside of here, we're actually going to use our state controller, and we'll listen to the update state bindable event. So of course, we'll go ahead and connect this. The parameter is going to be action, which of course is a part of the state controller.update state action type. And now inside of here, if the action type is update setting and the setting that's being updated is menu blur, then what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and call the toggle blur effect function with the value of action.value. So what this will do is if the player has the settings GUI visible on their screen and then they toggle on or off the menu blur setting, this will actually cause the blur to be updated. So if they're in the settings GUI and they disable the menu blur, then it'll actually make the blur be disabled for the player. And then of course, if the setting is already disabled and then they enable it, it'll then display the blur to the player. And now with that being said, that's all that we're going to do inside of this module script. So we can actually go ahead and close out of this. And now the last thing that we need to do is start scripting the settings GUI. So we can do this by going inside of the GUIs folder, and then we're going to go ahead and just duplicate one of the module scripts that already exists inside of here so that we can save some time by having some pre-existing variables created for us. So we'll go ahead and duplicate the reset module, and then we'll rename this to be called settings and open it. Inside of here, we actually don't need either of these services. Instead, we do need the replicated storage. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. Of course, we don't need the player variable, so we can delete that. We do need the GUI controller, but in addition to the GUI controller, we also need the settings controller as well. So let's create a variable for that. In addition to the settings controller, we also need the state controller. So we'll go ahead and create a variable for that one as well. And then we also need to create a variable for the settings config as well. So we'll say require replicated storage.configs.settings, just like that. And then I'm going to delete pretty much all the functions that are already created inside of here, just like that. We don't need the button text. And now let's go ahead and start working from the GUI variable. So of course, we don't care about the right GUI. Instead, we actually want the settings GUI. Then we can delete the bun variable. We don't even need that. But let's go ahead and create a variable called frame, which of course is GUI.frame. Then we want to create a variable for the container scrolling frame. So we'll go ahead and say container equals frame.container. Then we want to create a variable for the open button. And now to get the open button, we need to use the GUI controller. We need to use the GUI's table inside of there. Then we want to access the left screen GUI. And inside of left screen GUI, we have a frame called frame. And then we actually have our text button stored inside of here. So we want to access the settings text button. Then finally, we want to create a variable for the exit button. And how do we get the exit button? Well, inside of the frame, there is a text button called exit, just like that. Then we're going to create two quick constants. The first one is going to be called onColor, which is actually going to be a color3.fromRGB. And then we're going to set this to a nice green color because this is what the toggle button will appear as for the setting when it is toggled on. Then we can go ahead and copy and paste this. And for our second constant, we'll go ahead and call this off color. And then since this is the off color, we'll go ahead and use a nice red, just like that. Now, the first thing that we're going to do inside of here is go ahead and create the onStart function. So we'll go ahead and say function shared.onStart. And the first thing that we want to do inside of this function is actually set up opening and closing the GUI. So in order to do this, we're going to say open button.mousebutton1click :connect and create an anonymous function inside of here. So whenever the open button is clicked, what we want to do is we actually want to modify the enabled property of the screen GUI. So we're going to say GUI.enabled equals. And with the open button, of course, if the open button is clicked, we could just simply set this to true to make the GUI visible. But to make this a little bit nicer, what we're also going to do is we're going to say not GUI.enabled. So now what the open button will actually do is it'll both open the GUI and display it to the player, but it'll also close the GUI and hide it from the player as well if the GUI has already been opened. So we can kind of use the open button as both an open and a closing button without really having to do any extra work. In addition to that though, we don't want to only just open and display the GUI, we also need to try to blur the screen as well if the screen should be blurred. And how can we do this? Well, we'll go ahead and use the GUI controller and we'll use the toggle blur effect function. And now what are we going to pass through for is GUI active? Well, we would just go ahead and pass through GUI.enabled just like that. So now we'll go ahead and toggle the blur effect and toggle it on or off based on if the GUI is visible or not. And that's all that we have to do for opening the GUI. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for the exit button. So we'll go ahead and say exit button.mousebutton1click :connect, create an anonymous function. And this one's a little bit more simple. What we're going to do is we're going to say GUI controller.toggle blur effect. We'll go ahead and pass through false because the GUI is not enabled. And then we'll also set the enabled property of the GUI to false because we no longer want it to be visible. Cool. So that was pretty simple. And that's how we actually open and hide the GUI. The next thing we're going to do is actually create a function for generating all of the settings and displaying them to the player. So this is going to be a part of the local table and it's going to be called generate settings. Inside of this function, what we want to do is we want to iterate through all of the settings inside of the settings config. So we'll go ahead and say for setting, value in settingsconfig.config do. Now, remember, inside of our container frame, we created another frame, which is called template. So as we iterate through each of the settings in our game, we want to go ahead and create a brand new template and then basically fill in all of the information and all of the specific stuff for each of the individual settings. So to do this, we're going to create a variable called clone. Then we want to go ahead and clone the template. So we're going to say container.template: clone. Now that we've cloned it, we need to make sure that we parent that to the container. So we're going to say clone.parent equals container. Then let's go ahead and update the name of this to the specific setting. In addition to renaming it, we also want to set the visible property of it equal to true to make sure that it is actually being displayed. And now let's actually start modifying some of the specific stuff to this specific setting. So we're going to say clone.setting because remember, we have a text label inside of the frame called setting. We're going to update the text of this equal to the actual setting. And then inside of the frame, we also have a text button, which is called toggle. So we'll go ahead and say clone.toggle.mousebutton1click :connect and create an anonymous function inside of here. And now what do we want to do when we actually click on a button to toggle the setting? Well, we want to go ahead and use the settings controller and use the toggle setting function. So we'll go ahead and pass through the specific setting that we want to toggle. And now that's pretty much all that we have to do inside of this function. So we can go back to the onStart function, and the first thing that we can do inside of here is actually go ahead and call the generate settings function. But now we need to go ahead and actually create another function, which is going to be a part of the local table, and this is going to be called toggle setting. And this function is going to have a single parameter, which is going to be the specific setting that is being toggled. And when we call this function, what we want to do is we actually want to update the color of the toggle button to display if the setting is enabled or not. So we're going to create a variable called frame. And what we mean by this is the specific template frame of that specific setting that we already created, which is stored inside of the container. So we're going to say container, find first child, and then we're going to look for the frame named that specific setting. Now, if for some reason we're not able to find that frame, then we're going to go ahead and return end and stop the function right there. But now that we know that we've gotten the frame, what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called isEnabled, and we're going to check if the setting is actually enabled. And we can do this by using the settingsconfig.getSettingValue. And then we'll go ahead and pass through the stateController.getState and the specific setting. And now inside of the frame, we should have a text button called toggle. And what we're going to do is we're going to update the background color 3 of it based on if the setting is enabled. And if the setting is enabled, then we're going to go ahead and set this to the on color. Otherwise, we're going to set it to the off color because the setting is disabled. And with that being said, we've now fully finished with creating this function. So let's go ahead and use it. First things first, we're actually going to go ahead and use it inside of the generate settings function because we're going to do this as the last thing after we generate each of the frames for the settings. So let's go ahead and call local toggle setting and pass through the specific setting. The reason that we're doing this is because we actually need to update the background color 3 of the toggle button, which we do not do inside of here. Could we do that directly inside of here? Yes, we could. I mean, literally, we could pretty much just copy and paste this directly inside of here and do it inside of here as well. Well, really, we would say clone.toggle. But the thing is why are we going to write this logic 2 times? There's just no point in actually doing that. So rather than writing this logic 2 times, we're just going to go ahead and create a single function for it. And then we'll go ahead and call that function, which does that exact same thing. Now, you might be thinking, well, we're only using this function inside of here. What's the point of that? That's actually not the case. We also want to use this function in another location, and we're going to use it when the player's state changes as well. Because of course, every single time the player's setting state changes and a setting has been toggled differently, then of course we need to update the color of the button as well. So going back to our onStart function, towards the bottom of this, what we're going to do is we're going to use the state controller. We're going to use the update state bindable event. We'll listen to the event. We'll connect to it. Of course, for the first parameter, that's going to be called action. It's going to be of the state controller.update state action type. And now if the action type is update setting, then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to go ahead and call toggle setting, and we'll go ahead and pass through the setting of the action, just like that. So now every single time the player setting is actually toggled differently from the server side, it's going to go ahead and update the GUI to reflect that. And now we are pretty much completely finished with this, but one last thing that we want to do. Remember, inside of the generate settings function, every single time we generate a brand new setting, one of the things that we do is we make sure that the clone is visible. Since we make it visible, one thing that we need to do is inside of the onStart function, we actually want to make the default template that we created not visible. The reason for that is because that template that we initially created is not going to be used in any way. Every single time we actually use it, it's just to be cloned. So we never actually use that template at all. And because of that, we wouldn't want it to be displayed to the player. So we'll go inside of the container, we'll get the template frame, and then we'll just set the visibility of this equal to false. Now, you might be thinking, why are you doing this inside of here? Why don't we just manually set the visibility of it to false inside of the GUI? The reason for that is because in the next episode, we're actually going to do a pretty big update to the GUI controller, where inside there, we're actually going to add a function, which is going to automatically hide anything named template for us. So that allows us to keep the templates visible when we're working on the GUIs, and it also saves us time from ever having to do anything like this by manually making them not visible. So we'll just write one single function, and then the GUI controller will call that when it starts up, and then hide all of the templates by default. Anyways, with that being said, that's actually all that we have to do inside of this entire script, so we can go ahead and close out of that. And with that being said, we're fully finished with implementing the system, so let's go ahead, hop into our game, and test this out. So once we get into our game, let's go ahead and try to click on the settings button. When we click on the settings button, we can actually see that the GUI does appear, and we can even see that our background is being blurred as well. Let's go ahead and try to toggle the sound effect setting, and when we click on the button, we can actually see that it becomes red, and if we click it again, we can then see it goes over to green. We can also see that by default, easy mode is toggled off, so that looks to be working perfectly. Then let's click the settings button once again to make sure that it actually hides it, which it does. Then let's test out the exit button. When we click the exit button, that makes the GUI disappear. And now finally, let's test out the menu blur. When we click that, the GUI is no longer blurred. So we can go ahead and exit that, open up the GUI, and we can still see that there is no blur. Let's go ahead and re-enable that. When we re-enable that, we can actually see the blur. When we close the GUI, we no longer see it. And now when we open it up, we see it once again. So this is actually all working perfectly. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you enjoyed the video. As always, if you did, make sure you smash the like button. If you want to support me and gain access to the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other resources and assets that you can use in your own Roblox game to easily make one, there's a link down below in the description to my website or my Patreon where you can get all those things and support me as well. As always, if this video did work for you, please leave a comment down below letting other people know that it did work, because I really appreciate that and it helps other people out knowing that this is still working days, months, and years later. Anyways, I hope that you guys did enjoy, and I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.